now we'll start the first session. So the question for the first session is, how are the state responses to the pandemic strengthening authoritarian regimes? I suppose the way we could do this is I'll start with Daniel Perez. I'll ask Daniel how this looks like in Brazil. We don't necessarily have to follow the order listed in the program. What I'd like to do is have the 6 people taking part in this session to have a discussion with each other. So please, Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jeffrey and Lala to make all this possible. It's a great opportunity for me to be here with you all. This is not an easy question. First of all, because all I can say that I see no intention of Bolsonaro government to fight the pandemic. He uses, I think so, it as an opportunity to spread a culture of fear and violence among the population. He's constantly pushing the institutions one against the other, like he's rallying against our Supreme Court, he's rallying against Congress, and in these 2 months we have 2 different ministers of health. So now we have a general, a military that is responsible for all government politics against the virus. And now he just published a protocol for the use of chloroquine. This is something we have in common with the United States, this kind of chloroquine fashion or chloroquine, I don't know. And so, yeah, the states, the local states, the local like mayors and local governments, they are doing well. But again, the federal government acts against social distancing policies, against economic measures that would help the poor and even the companies to keep jobs and to keep work, to keep the economic running.
So Jacek, does this remind you or of the situation in Poland, or contrast with the situation in Poland?
Yeah, I mean, there are clearly similarities, especially the fact that you are not sure if the current government, our current populist government, is really trying to fight the pandemic, or create the reality of fighting it and realize or carry out its political aims. I basically, I'm sorry that I still haven't sent the paper, but I have it sketched, and I called it, as you know, from the agenda, a pandemic as a catalyst for authoritarianism or populist authoritarianism. And I wanted to mention at least 3 aspects and 3 points where the pandemic gave the opportunity, but also a reason for the government to accelerate, but also to intensify certain authoritarian policies or tendencies. And so the first point would be that it gave the reason to further curtail the civic rights, such as right of assembly, and also increase the general repressiveness of the political system. So when lockdown was announced, there were a number of restrictions which were being announced, which were then enforced in a way which is characteristic of authoritarian regimes and which we also remember from the old communist times. That is, the regulations were often not evidence-based. They were unclear. They were very difficult to observe, and they were randomly and arbitrarily enforced. So there was this sense, growing sense of the population that the restrictions, which were first accepted as reasonable and necessary, were completely mishandled, and that they were just an excuse to crack down on some civil liberties, and especially on the right to peaceful assembly and to political protest. And I think we will hear more about it from Helena and Elżbieta Korolczuk, but this was very clear that the government dealt with any protests which happened on the way in a very brutal way, using the pandemic as a justification. So that was the first aspect. The second authoritarian sort of tendency, which was increased by the pandemic, was a ever greater reliance on political propaganda, as opposed to actually solving problems and you know, keeping the society safe. And this was the tendency that I called in my earlier paper the politics of parallel reality. So the government really used all the resources to create the appearance that they are very effective in fighting the pandemics. They staged these propaganda feats like receiving the masks and protective equipment from China using this biggest plane in the world. And then later it turned out that all this equipment that was important didn't actually had proper tests and was worthless. But this was so there was this gap between propaganda and reality, but also a very consistent propaganda, which, as I say, for at least the first month seemed to have a big appeal. And in fact, the ratings of the government improved, and now they very quickly deteriorating because there are cracks in this propaganda, in this parallel reality. And third, and probably the most important aspect, is that it sped up or accelerated the infringement of democratic processes and the rule of law, the attack on the rule of law. And especially this is the case with the Polish elections that didn't happen, and the way the government used the anti-pandemic regulations to manipulate the electoral law, which ultimately ended in failure. And this is the interesting aspect of this, that on one hand, the crisis provided government with additional tools and legitimization of these authoritarian policies, but in each of the aspects, it led to a backlash. And especially with the elections, the government wanted to have them in May, as was scheduled before the pandemics, and which would be completely undemocratic in a way that the opposition was unable to have a proper campaign. It would be dangerous, and the opposition tried to stop this. The reason why Kaczynski insisted to have quick elections was exactly because he expected the support for the government to fall and Duda chances decreasing if the elections are postponed, as the constitution would demand. So it was the case when, for example, anti-pandemic legislation was amended during late night voting sessions with some so-called technical amendments, which then turned out to be very meaningful in terms of how the elections were expected to be run. But what happened was, actually, even though the opposition was quite divided at the time as to how to respond to these proposals, in the end, they managed to stop Kaczynski. And this is a big change in Polish political landscape, because Kaczynski and the ruling party actually had to face a defeat. The elections didn't happen, even though the way in which they were cancelled is another example of sort of unconstitutional behavior, because the constitution would demand that we have a proper process of calling for a state of disaster, which would allow to postpone the elections. This didn't happen. The elections did not happen because of the political will of the leader of the main party, which is completely illegal. And so we are still in the situation of being of legal chaos, but with also new prospects for the opposition. So maybe I will stop with this on this sort of broad sketch of the situation in Poland and impact of pandemics on authoritarianism.
So I'm tempted to ask Pavel. Now, one thing that's suggested by your comment is that it's clear that our discussions will be from session to session, ostensibly addressing different questions, but it very, very clearly, all of us have a lot to say about many of the issues that are raised as we go along. So the idea will be to sustain this through the two-day discussion. I'm tempted to ask Pavel whether the kind of socioeconomic class consequences of economic policy, how that side of things illuminate, substantiate, or maybe call into some question what Jacek just said about the Polish situation. Pavel?
Yeah, sure. With pleasure. Well, the big question is, of course, can you get away with it? And how do you get away with it, right? I mean, how do you keep your support? If you are, engaging in blatant propaganda, if you are not that effective in handling the pandemic, if you're sending mixed signals to the general population and also to your voters, to your voting base. And all this chaotic regulations very often introduced without any evidence, as Jacek already mentioned, this was also very difficult to accept for the voters of Law and Justice and supporters of the current government. So how do you get away with this? Well, of course, what they're trying to do is something that they already succeeded at in the past with certain economic policies. So whether they will lose some substantial part of their electoral base, to me, the big question is whether they will handle the economic crisis emerging from the pandemic effectively or not. And so far, the response from the government is very mixed in that regard. I've been arguing for some time, and my piece that was published by Public Seminar some months ago, I was arguing that, well, we have to really address this image of the Law and Justice as a party that is socially conservative, but at the same time very dedicated to redistributive policies. It's true that some of its social policies were or still are to some extent redistributive. In the initial years of the Law and Justice government, we've seen an improvement, for example, declining poverty rates, improvement in people, number of people who were able to pay back their loans and so on and so forth. But these effects were very short term. And now they are largely consumed by staggering inflation. Poland had already really substantial inflation before the pandemic, one of the highest in Europe. And now I'm guessing, and many economists are saying that it will become even worse. So whatever people are getting as a result of redistribution introduced by the Law and Justice, this is becoming worth less and less because of the inflation. And now, of course, the Law and Justice government, just like many governments in the EU and elsewhere, they have introduced a certain anti-crisis response in the economy, the so-called anti-crisis shield, tarcza antykryzysowa. It had 3 different versions that are to a certain extent mutually exclusive. in a sense that the first shield was criticized across the board for being insufficient. The second one is the largest program of quantitative easing in the history of Polish economy. It's really substantial. It's around 200 billion zloty. Direct financial help to companies is already at 30 million. So it's almost the amount of money that people receive as you know, flagship within the flagship program of the Law and Justice, the so-called Family 500 Plus, the family benefit for every child. So with the direct financial help to companies, we are already at this, we're almost at this level. And my guess is that we will exceed this level very, very soon. But at the same time, there is a third version of the shield, which is basically enabling companies to lay off people easier. If you are working 2 jobs, if you already reached the retirement age, your employer will be able to lay you off without normal procedures or regular procedures. So basically, this is and moreover, the shield is also creating two very different categories of employees. The one are people who are self-employed. Sometimes they are not voluntary self-employed, but they are forced to be self-employed. They're working in precarious conditions, and their economic situation is really difficult. But there are people who are simply operating as self-employed because it gives them certain tax benefits. They are basically taxed lower than the regular workers. And the shield, if you lose 15% of your monthly income, provides you with really substantial financial assistance if you are self-employed. But if you lose your job and you are employed on a regular contract, you have to rely on unemployment benefits. So there is no extra safety net for you. So basically this creates two very different categories of people. So my argument, and what I also argued in my paper, is that this economic response to the crisis is very insufficient. So the cracks in this image of Law and Justice as a party that is dedicated to redistribution, to social justice, will become even more problematic during this pandemic. And this will create enormous social tensions. The unemployment rates, according to the IMF, will rise 3 times this year. So it's increased by 200%, staggering increase to 10% of general population working age. The poverty rates, which were already growing last year, will grow even further. And moreover, a lot of entrepreneurs are complaining that they don't receive any financial help. So you already have people in the streets right now protesting against this.
So actually, that really intrigues me. People in the streets. So you know, how there's the kind of puzzling for me still, Jacek, fact that somehow, despite everything, the political pressures were developed so that the ruling party didn't get what it wanted as far as the election goes. So the question is like, how to constitute political pressure in the time of social isolation. You know, there's Pavel points out that there's the promise of economic justice and decency for the less well-off, but not delivered. That creates tensions. But then the question is, how do these tensions become translated into some politically significant action? And what does the regime do to forestall that? And part of it is simply the same mechanism that is used to socially isolate us from the virus may be the instrument that isolates us from our political capacity to articulate opposition. and that leads me to think of a very different part of the world. I'm thinking, okay, you know, in Hong Kong, there's this very, very significant, in your terms, even anti-colonial movement against the People's Republic. And the coincidence of social isolation for pandemic and the need to quell this social protest is very, very convenient for the regime. And I'm wondering if, so this whole question of how does social unrest, disquiet, sense of economic injustice, sense of geopolitical domination, how is that sustained under these situations? And more significantly for the topic of this session, how do the authorities, what instruments do the authorities have to actually block that? So I'm wondering what you have to say about that, Paul.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's really such a fascinating case, of course, because we all witnessed the protests there last year. And of course, somewhere along in the fall, there's a ban on wearing masks in public, very ironically, because 3 months later, everyone is wearing masks in Hong Kong as the coronavirus spreads to Hong Kong. You know, extremely high level, one of the most, in economic terms, one of the most unequal places in the world, you know, with Gini coefficients in the 0.5, 0.6 levels even. Paradoxically, maybe not paradoxically, but if you think about you know, any municipal government or even, you know, national government that had daily flights from Wuhan right up through January, yet has had, you know, thinking of New York City, we know about the cases and the deaths here. Hong Kong, 7.4 million people, 4 deaths, and only 1,000 cases. To get back to your question, the Hong Kong government has this toolkit of both British colonial legislation to enact, you know, all sorts of measures to ban unlawful assemblies, and including the mask ban that I referred to earlier was invoked on the basis of an old 1922 colonial ordinance. And at the same time, of course, you have the Beijing government pressuring the Hong Kong government. In some ways, you know, Hong Kong is not a case of strengthening an authoritarian regime, if you talk about the Hong Kong regime, but you're sort of weakening the legitimacy of a hybrid regime. Hong Kong will have elections in the fall. The chief executive, Carrie Lam, of course, is the person holding that position now. That position has never been open for direct election, and that's part of this demand for universal suffrage. But the most interesting convergence, I think, of the pandemic control measures, along with the contestations over universal suffrage and demands for electoral reform in Hong Kong, has been over the slight uptick in cases that happened in March, to which the government responded with all sorts of renewed measures to you know, do social distancing and so forth. But then as the city has reopened, and even yesterday I saw in the Times, you know, the bars and restaurants are now reopening, but the government has imposed, because of the virus, not because of politics or the threat of protests, though of course, you know, the real reason. In March, when the cases first revived, bans on gatherings of more than 4 people. Okay, in late April, that number was extended out to 8 people. Bans on gatherings of any group larger than 8. Well, just Monday of this week, the government announced that it was going to conveniently extend that 8-person larger than 8-person ban up to June 4th, which conveniently means that this year's annual vigil, which usually attracts hundreds of thousands of people to a park in Hong Kong to honor the victims of June 4th, 1989, that's up for grabs now. Will it be? Will people show up? Will people gather? Will they do it on June 5th if the ban extends only through June 4th? So it's going to be a summer in which, a spring and summer in which there will be all sorts of tactical and strategic maneuvers by the opposition as well as by the government to get around the colonial era and contemporary measures to enact bans on, contestations in public space. At the same time, and just to conclude, and what's extremely troubling for many people is Beijing's effort to essentially, de-democratize Hong Kong through nationalization. That is to say, two laws passed a law passed recently in China about disrespecting, criminalizing the disrespect of the playing of the national anthem. They're trying to make the Hong Kong legislature pass a similar kind of measure, and that's where you saw, if you've noticed, some of the physical fisticuffs going on in the Hong Kong legislature recently. That was what that was about. And then an old perennial, Beijing's insistence that Hong Kong enact a national security legislation, which started protests back in 2003 and are going to certainly create all sorts of opportunities for and resistance when the Hong Kong government is pressured to pass similar legislation, because it's national security legislation, criminalizing threats to national security to the nation state of the People's Republic of China, and not so to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region.
So Andras, you really paint, in your paper, a kind of general account, immediately drawing upon the Hungarian case of how this repression against the virus and repression against democracy and politics may play itself out. So I wonder if you could say a few words about that in terms of what you have to say in your paper, but also have to say about the case of Hungary, but also what you've just heard coming from Brazil, Hong Kong, Poland. Did I forget anyone? I don't think so. And in your case, Hungary.
Yes, thank you very much. Just today, the Hungarian government and the parliament passed the law which made possible for the national security to search all data of individuals. So there is a danger that they will connect healthcare data with all other data, and they can create really a securitized control over the citizens. What happened in Hungary was that just about 1 week after the outbreak of the pandemic, Viktor Orbán decided to ask the parliament to give him a special rights. So there is a state of emergency in Hungary since late March. And of course, it is officially about doing necessary steps to counter the pandemic, but in Hungary, but actually it is not defined how to, whether it should be narrow or broad. So basically the prime minister can do a lot of unrelated things, which is completely unrelated to the pandemic, to govern by decree. But interestingly, the parliament is still in place. So there is a parallel governance by decrees and a functioning parliament. There is not much difference between the two because Fidesz, the ruling party, has a qualified majority in the parliament. So it is a double game. Maybe it is just for Orbán to prove that he is the master over the country. It is now, I think there is a quite unprecedented situation in Hungary. The prime minister has an unlimited power. And that shows that maybe he doesn't even trust in his own parliamentary faction. So some legislation is done by the parliament, others by himself, and somehow he wants to implement a lot of things which will be surviving the pandemic. So the point is that after the pandemic, a lot of element of securitization and related legislation will stay with us. He already hinted that there will be a second wave of the pandemic coming back in October, November. So we have to be prepared for that. So the argument goes that even if he resigns from his extraordinary powers, at one point he will take it back later on. So there is a sort of legal uncertainty, and the law is used in a discriminatory manner. For instance, you know, ruling illegal and people of transgender people, totally unrelated to the pandemic. And I can mention a couple of other things. So it was also mentioned that people who are spreading false news can be taken into custody by the police. And of course, nothing is defined, and it is not used against educated people in Budapest, but it is just to spread the fear and hatred in the countryside among elderly people, uneducated people. It looks like the government is already preparing for the economic crisis. So they are now using the pandemic to introduce tough measures, which can be later on used in disciplining the population after the pandemic, but during the economic crisis. So in a lot of ways, Michel Foucault or George Orwell or Giorgio Agamben, these explanations come to fore in Hungary.
Yeah. Michal Vašečka, perhaps you want to start the general questioning now, drawing upon your experience in Slovakia, and maybe explain what you meant by the provocative title of the paper that you proposed to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, Slovakia was in a peculiar situation at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we had the parliamentary elections on February 29th, Saturday, and the first case has been recorded in Bratislava in Slovakia on March 6th, which means 6 days after the elections. And immediately afterwards, on Monday, March 9th, Bratislava region started to react very swiftly and quickly, and closing the city, firstly city, and then since Wednesday, March 11, basically country was completely closed and locked, and that was probably one of the fastest reactions. And also that's why Slovakia is in shockingly good numbers, but I will return to it. So the crisis was handled first by the previous government and by previous Prime Minister Pellegrini, who basically wanted to overshadow all the wrongdoings of previous government, oligarchy government, and he managed. So he was really trying hard, and then the new government came completely unexperienced, and they focus only and exclusively on COVID-19, basically not doing first 3 to 4 weeks anything else. And let me explain what was happening. Igor Matovic, as a new prime minister, is a populistic politician. I mean, there are 4 other Slovak participants. They can join me. And it's sometimes difficult to describe him in classical political terms. Badly educated representative of petty bourgeoisie, suffering by narcissistic disorder. And this person basically, unlike many authoritarian leaders in the world, he decided to win the race in the world, basically trying to keep Slovakia out of the pandemia. And surprisingly, he managed. Slovakia has 1,500 cases, only 28 deaths, compared to, let's say, New Zealand, which is usually given an example to the whole world. You know, this is not an island, basically. Also, the density of population is much higher. And the truth is that somehow, miraculously, COVID-19 was not affecting the country so dramatically. Even when recently Bratislava sewage system was tested in the same way as in New York City, they didn't find anything, you know, no
Michal.
traces of COVID-19. Yeah, I'm talking too much. Yes. So let me.
I'm really intrigued by the title. So could you just
share it with everyone? No. I'm heading there because okay. And now. And that miracle is just confirming somehow, of course, I'm making fun of it, the efficiency of how Catholic priests who were flying over the territory of Slovakia repeatedly with relicts of saints in order to save Slovakia from COVID-19 and to fight it. So back to your question. Government has been firstly adopting various legislative norms recently in the last few weeks that were not legal since they were adopted by the crisis center, which is of course was under governmental office, but it's only advisory body to government. Secondly, Igor Matovic with this messianistic appeal started to attack media, civil society, intellectuals. And let me remind you that Slovakia went through in the past various regimes, such as regime of Vladimir Mečiar, and even Vladimir Mečiar was not attacking media and civil society, so quickly as Matovic. Matovic basically was not, didn't wait for a long time, and he started to strengthen position of conservative forces and clerical forces so in other words, this anti-corruption appeal, which with he won, surprisingly strengthened conservative and clerical forces whose primary goal was to fight political correctness, gender ideology, strengthen position of a Catholic Church, and most importantly, to pass the very strict anti-abortion law, which is very clear. So the parish republic, which I have in my paper, is basically reference to clerical and fascist Slovak state in the years 1939, 1945, which many called clero-fascist regime.
And we'll hear papers about that. We're going to discuss that more fully later on from other Slovak colleagues.
Yeah, and it was gently called Parish Republic, and this is exactly what we are discussing as a civil society in Slovakia in last 4 to 5 weeks, how quickly and basically without much discussion, Slovakia is backsliding from previous secular model of society that has been in place since creation of Czechoslovakia in 1918, basically. So COVID-19 has dramatic and direct effects on firstly secular model, but also on the quality of democracy as well.
I'm seeing various nods from your Slovak colleagues. Some moving up and down, and others going with some questions. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we proceed. Time is running out. Theoretically, we have 9 minutes for general discussion, which is very frustrating, but this session had more papers, so maybe we can give ourselves an extra 5 minutes and then have a 10-minute coffee break. So the floor is open. If anyone, including the participants who just spoke, want to raise questions, kind of make some comparative points, yourselves declare the truth, please speak. We've agreed that the way to do this is to just indicate in the chat room that you'd like to speak, and Lala will actually then kind of allow you to speak in the order that you raise the question. So If no one has yet written to Lala, the floor is open for anyone to speak.
I have Jeff, Isaac, and I saw Andras, his hand up.
Okay, good. Jeff, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. I'm not muted.
Now I hear you. Now I hear you.
Okay. So it's a question mainly for Andras, but I think a couple of the other panelists also got at this. So, but Andras, particularly his closing by referencing not only Foucault but Agamben.
And Orwell.
And Orwell, yes. But I'm particularly interested in Agamben because Agamben said some pretty controversial things about the effort to fight the virus at all in public policy terms. And the critique that you offered has some striking similarities to the critique that the libertarian gun-toting right-wingers in this country are making of Democratic governors like Andrew Cuomo, for example, or Whitmer in Michigan. And I wonder if you think that there's any place for a liberal democratic public policy of social distancing and kind of emergency response, or if the mere policy response is necessarily authoritarian.
Very good question. I think policy making on this pandemic is not necessarily authoritarian. I was referring to the Hungarian practice and try to give some theoretical frame to this. And I understand that this might sound very differently in a different country. So I am not promoting this far-right libertarian neoconservative stance.
Also far left.
But you know, even those guys look nice in the current situation in Hungary, where social distancing is often interpreted as social segregation. So repeatedly, local and central authorities interpret social distance as social segregation. They are trying to turn Budapest people against the countryside people, young people against the old people, those who have coronavirus and those who have other diseases. So I think it's a very effective policy of, you know, dividing the country. Of course, theoretically, it is absolutely possible to have a liberal democratic policy making on this issue. It is just something which the Hungarian government could not manage to do. Maybe in other countries you can bring good examples. And once I have the chance to speak, I just want to ask a question. I was talking about securitization and legislation and the use of big data to control the population. But I forgot to mention that one of the first things that the government did was to bring a lot of military personnel to state-controlled firms and also to hospitals. So there is a visible militarization, and maybe other authoritarian-minded leaders like to use the military. I wonder whether it is the case in Brazil or Poland or Hong Kong or somewhere else, whether militarization of life can occur at all. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán already mentioned that don't worry about losing your jobs, because the government will always offer you public work, and also you can go to the military for underpaid jobs. So you know, in imagined country of public workers and soldiers as a response to the pandemic, it's very scary actually, and I wonder whether it came to the discourse in other countries or not.
I have Gabor and then Jacek.
Thank you. I have a short question to Daniel about Brazil. To me, it looks like Brazil is pretty much following the US playbook, like where you have the crazy guy in power who completely misreads the situation and does all kinds of weird stuff, to summarize it very briefly. But then what was very interesting about the US case is Trump's and the government's approach to social policy, which showed that sort of the neoconservatives are willing to increase social spending and also, you know, compromise on the issue of health insurance. And I was wondering what the situation in Brazil was. Can you tell us something about social policy responses of the Bolsonaro government, or it's also completely missing?
About the government, about Bolsonaro government, I can say he offers no policy at all. But in Congress, yes. So we have two political actors, the government, the federal government, and the Congress. And the Congress is leading the political process in building all the economic and health system to help the population. So what Bolsonaro do is he does not veto the laws that pass in the Congress, but he makes it hard to be implemented. Did I answer you? So, but they are pretty much the same. Bolsonaro and Trump, they are really close, and yes.
So the Congress, it did introduce some social policy measures.
Yes, yes, economic policies, and also the possibility of and health policies.
Okay,
but
thank you.
In Congress.
Jacek?
Can I? Yes. Yeah, I wanted to respond to Jeff Isaac's question, which I think is a crucial question for our, not just this session, but the conference. I mean, is there a democratic way of dealing with this, this type of situation? And I think that the evidence in Poland is, I mean, hypothetically, if we had a normal government, there were constitutional provisions which were there ready to be used to do it, these restrictions in an orderly and accountable way. And the criticism of the way that Polish government implemented the restrictions was not because they limited our civic rights, but first of all, because they didn't have proper legal foundations, but also, and more importantly, because they were so chaotic, they were so arbitrary, and then excessively enforced when there was no need to enforce them in such a way, because in this first period, at least the first month, the population was very disciplined by itself. And in fact, many people started to behave and introduce some measures long before the government decided that this is the right thing to do. So I think that it's not just possible to have a sort of democratic management of pandemic, but also the Polish case shows how challenging pandemic is to an authoritarian or populist authoritarian government, because it has different priorities and sort of is sort of hitting or unable to deal with its own contradiction. So I think in a way I'm even though I spoke about catalysm or catalytic effect, it's at the same time I'm modestly optimistic about the current situation, because the government is in probably deepest political crisis since 2015 in the outcome of the mismanagement. And there was a clear democratic alternative to managing this crisis.
I also have Mark. So please, if you have a question or a comment, just write in the in the comments directly to me or to everyone, and I'll put you on the list. So Mark?
Yeah, I think that is a crucial question for the conference, is about the democratic way of responding to the situation. And I think one way of talking about it in the Hong Kong case was that initially the government was really slow to respond. And in large part, those great figures are a response or a result of Hong Kong civil society mobilizing, getting out ahead of the government, is insisting through a strike by recently unionized medical workers to provide masks to the entire population free of cost, and to close the border with China, which Carrie Lam was reluctant to do at the beginning. So, there is a civil society kind of role here for doing this in a way that is kind of bottom up as opposed to top down. And then the greatest example of or maybe one way of examining this question is through another case, and that is the case of Taiwan, whose president was just inaugurated, I guess, overnight with a landslide presidential victory, a democracy that has been held up by many in the epidemiological community as having one of the best responses of anywhere in the world. Ironically, being, of course, excluded from the World Health Organization and the World Health Assembly by the good old PRC.
I also have Julia.
Hi, so Michal spoke in detail about the role of religion and in particular the Catholic Church in the context of Slovakia. And I would just love to hear from the other contexts, from Hungary to Hong Kong to Poland, of the role of religion and various forms of church activity in this crisis.
I'll add that the center of Malchas's paper is actually the role it plays in Georgia. But
which you wrote for my class, so I actually
yeah.
Yeah.
I also have Pavel.
Yeah, just very quickly to follow up on what's already been said about the democratic response to the pandemic and whether it's possible. Of course it is. Taiwan, which was already mentioned, is a perfect example. But of course, in many countries which have not experienced the SARS pandemic, to build such a system of coordination would be impossible at very short notice. So of course it was impossible in Central Eastern Europe, which has never experienced, or at least recently has not experienced a similar pandemic. But it does not mean that the democratic response is not possible. I mean, quasi-authoritarian or illiberal regimes are very good at imposing lockdowns. And this was initially accepted by the population, but the more chaotic the response got, the lower the support was, and this chaos at some point became quite dangerous, especially when it comes to managing the healthcare system. And what also became really dangerous was a total lack of trust and cooperation between the central government and the local governments. So the answer to the question is, yeah, of course it's possible, but you need trust and you need coordination between different levels of government.
Okay, so I think that's a really, really interesting note to end the discussion for the first session on. What I find most interesting about the discussion is that as we're focusing on how the pandemic has strengthened authoritarianism in this session, we've naturally been moving to identifying cracks in the authoritarian power. And interestingly, and I have to admit coincidentally, the next session is on centralization versus municipal and local power. And I think as we're trying to formulate a crack, this tension between centralized power and more localized power is a very important factor. So we have, according to my clock, 9 minutes for a coffee break, and then we'll reconvene, and Jacek Kucharczyk will then take on the role of being facilitator of the discussion. So see you all in a few minutes.